You're listening to a production of the National Media Archive. To learn more or volunteer, go to nationalmediaarchive.com.
Picture this, a river longer than the distance from New York to Denver, touching 10 countries, threading through ancient empires and modern capitals. That's the Danube, Europe's second longest river and, some would argue, its most overlooked asset. Now, you might be thinking, a river? How important can that be in the age of bullet trains and highways? But let me tell you a story. In Vienna, where I live, locals still joke about Danube, the quirky North Bank, because the river once divided the Roman world from the so-called barbarians. Hydrography and Basin II technical terms define the Danube's immense catchment, spanning 19 countries and supporting nearly a quarter of the continent's population. Its role as a natural highway is unmatched. Yet, for decades, the Danube languished in political shadows, neglected, polluted, and underutilized for trade, a stark contrast to the Rhine's bustling river traffic. So why, in a world obsessed with speed and connectivity, are Austria and Hungary so fixated on resurrecting this ancient waterway? The answer is as much about future ambition as it is about history's lessons. Let's dive into the present. Austria and Hungary, once fierce rivals, are now stitched together by a common vision, turning the Danube into the central artery of a new European economic core. Imagine the irony. Former imperial adversaries now lobbying for Serbia's EU membership, all for the sake of this river. Waterway logistics and regional integration, fancy terms, but at heart, it's about making the Danube a seamless superhighway for goods and culture. You might ask, why not just build more railways or highways? Well, the Danube offers something unique. It's nature's ready-made infrastructure. No construction required, just smart management. But here's the conflict. Political borders and historic grudges still create bottlenecks. Serbia, not yet in the EU, is the main plug in this economic pipeline. The resolution? If Austria and Hungary can bring Serbia on board, the Danube could rival the Rhine, transforming Central and Eastern Europe from economic periphery to powerhouse. Let me take you back a century. The Danube once powered the mighty Austro-Hungarian Empire. Grain from Hungary, steel from Styria, tax collectors, and soldier saw moved along this waterway, binding disparate lands into a single system. But after the empire's collapse, the river's purpose shifted. Hydropolitics, the intersection of water management and power, suddenly mattered less than borders and nation-states. Now, you might say, isn't geography destiny? Sometimes, yes. But more often, it's how societies choose to leverage their geography that shapes their fate. In the 20th century, new nations squabbled over land, ignoring the Danube's potential as a shared resource. The river became less a connector, more a forgotten line on the map. But today, as the EU reimagines itself, the Danube is reemerging as a unifier if, and only if, old animosities can be set aside in favor of collective opportunity. Let me tell you about my neighborhood supermarket in Vienna. Within 20 minutes, I can buy Hungarian goulash, Bosnian burek, Austrian schnitzel, and Romanian jamari, culinary proof that the Danube isn't just a river, but a cultural corridor. Anthropogeography and diffusion, those are the academic terms for how landscapes shape societies and how traditions spread. But for us, it's as simple as sharing a meal or rooting for rival football teams. You might wonder, does a river really knit people together? Ask anyone from Budapest to Belgrade. The Danube is baked into cuisine, architecture, even the way people joke about neighbors. Yet this shared heritage is fragile as centuries of war, shifting borders, and political ideologies have threatened to unravel it time and again. The hope is that by reconnecting through trade and travel, the Danube's communities can rediscover what they have in common and build a new regional identity, Danubia, as some historians call it. The Cold War did the Danube no favors. Let me paint a picture. Toxic waste dumped in Hungary, shipwrecks clogging the river in Romania, and Yugoslavia ignoring the Danube entirely in favor of Adriatic ports. Environmental degradation and infrastructural underdevelopment, those are the technical scars of this era. But the real tragedy? Lost opportunities for economic and cultural exchange. Now you might be thinking, why didn't anyone fix it? The truth is, political rivalries and Soviet-era paranoia kept countries focused on themselves, not the shared good. Ironically, this neglect preserves stretches of the Danube's natural beauty, like the Danube Delta silver lining in a century of mismanagement. Today, those mistakes linger. Cleaning up the Danube is as much about healing old wounds as it is about modernizing infrastructure. Here's a twist. The Green Revolution on the Danube began in conservative Austria with a left-wing leader who went all in on hydropower in the 1970s. Austria wanted energy independence, and the Danube became its powerhouse. Hydroelectricity and public utility were terms that shaped the region's transformation. The model was so successful, everyone else on the Danube tried to copy it. Now, you might ask, isn't damming the river risky for the environment? Absolutely, but the trade-off was reliable, domestic energy at a time when oil shocks rocked Europe. The conflict? Balancing ecological preservation with the ever-growing demand for energy and economic growth. The Danube's hydropower legacy remains a blueprint, but also a warning about the need for sustainable cross-border resource management. Let's challenge a myth. Is the Balkans really a coherent region, or just a political invention? The answer may surprise you. Geopolitical construct and peninsulathos are the buzzwords. The Balkans was a term invented by Ottoman administrators and kept alive by Cold War politics, despite the area's fragmented geography. Now, you might be thinking, but aren't cultural similarities real? Sure, but the Danube region, or Danubia, has a stronger claim as a unifying force physically, economically, and even culturally. The conflict is between outdated mental maps and the practical reality of cross-border collaboration. Resolution? Maybe it's time to retire the old Balkan label and embrace more meaningful regional identity zones shaped by rivers, trade, and shared futures. Here's the crux. Serbia is the last non-EU country on the Danube. For the river to reach its full potential as Europe's trade superhighway, Serbia's integration is essential. Customs harmonization and diplomatic normalization technical terms for the tough process of joining the EU, but for Serbia, it's not just bureaucracy. There are deep historical grievances, especially with Croatia and the Netherlands. Now you might wonder, why not just join? For many Serbs, EU membership means confronting painful history and shifting alliances away from Russia, a traditional partner. Austria and Hungary are dangling the carrot, economic development, job growth, and the chance to regain Belgrade's old industrial glory. But the obstacles are real: diplomatic deadlocks, nationalist politics, and the ever-present weight of history. The Danube's future as a continental lifeline depends on resolving these conflicts. Let's talk transport. Rail lines are booming from Poland to Ukraine and Austria to Romania, but when it comes to moving bulk goods, nothing beats a river. Multimodal logistics and tonnage capacity, fancy terms that mean rivers can carry more for less. In the U.S., the Mississippi makes railroads almost redundant for freight. The Danube could do the same for Europe. You might ask, aren't trains faster? Sure, but for steel, grain, machinery, big, heavy cargo barges are unbeatable, and rivers don't need diesel, tracks, or constant maintenance. The conflict. Politicians love cutting ribbons on shiny new railways, but often neglect the low-cost, high-volume potential of river transport. If the Danube is restored to full navigability, Europe could see a logistical renaissance that makes landlocked countries suddenly feel like coastal powerhouses. Let's zoom out. The EU isn't just one big happy family. Behind the scenes, regional blocs are forming: the Nordics, the Visegrad Group, the Mediterranean Club, and now potentially Danubia. Regionalism and coalition politics, those are the technical drivers. In the wake of crises like the Eurozone meltdown, countries are clustering by culture, policy, and geography. Now, you might be thinking, isn't this divisive? Actually, it's pragmatic. These groups can push for shared interests, whether it's defense, energy, or infrastructure more effectively than the EU as a whole. The conflict. Balancing local collaboration with Europe, wide unity. Will Danubia, if it emerges, be a bridge or a barrier within the EU? The story is still unfolding. But one thing's clear. Understanding these new power blocks is key to predicting Europe's next moves on the global stage. So, what does the future hold for the Danube and its people? Let me end with a question. Will this ancient river finally reclaim its place at the heart of Europe, or remain a symbol of missed opportunities? Adaptive governance and cultural resilience, those are the keys. The Danube's fate depends on whether its nations can overcome old rivalries and invest in shared prosperity. Now, You might imagine a future where Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, and Bucharest are no longer economic backwaters, but hubs rivaling the Rhine Valley if politics, infrastructure, and ambition align. The conflict is clear. History pulls in one direction, but necessity pulls in another. Will the Danube become Europe's central artery again? Time will tell, but if you're from a country hoping to join the EU soon, ask yourself, which regional bloc will advance your interests best? The Danube story, after all, is Europe's story one of division, adaptation, and hope.